everyone. Welcome to another Levy lecture. We are thrilled to once again be joining Leslie Goddard, who will be portraying Jackie Kennedy. I have a couple of announcements and then we will get right to the portrayal. My name is Wendy Cromash. I'm on the board of the Levy Senior Center Foundation, and it is the foundation who is generously providing all the support for these lectures. Hang on one second. Okay, great. We also, in addition to the Levy Senior Center Foundation, I want to give a special shout out to Evanston, who has been a generous sponsor of the lectures, and they've renewed their sponsorship through the month of June. We have a full schedule up for June. You can make reservations for those lectures anytime. And thank you again to Evanston. They are opening their new building in Evanston in June. You can call them today to schedule a tour. It's stress-free living in downtown Evanston. Call them at 847-512-4232. Again, 847-512-4232. Just some ground rules. Everybody is muted for this webinar. We have over 400 people who will be joining us today, and it's impossible to call on people individually. However, please send all of your questions using the icons at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A function goes directly to me and to Leslie. I will be calling out the questions so that everyone hears, and Leslie will answer. She's extremely generous with her time, and you know, we will get to as many questions as we possibly can. Some of you have raised your hands. I cannot call on you, so please, if you have any comments, please just contact me through the Q&A. I think that's just about it. Okay, so we are going to transition now to Georgetown. It's 1964. The former First Lady has moved to a townhouse in Georgetown, and that is where we will be meeting her. Mrs. Kennedy, please join us.
Thank you. I also want to thank everyone for coming today, and I'm so glad that I haven't had to keep anyone waiting. It's so hard for me to get around these days. The crowds outside my house, they're just impossible. Tourists everywhere. Do you know they eat lunch on my lawn and throw their sandwich wrappers on the ground? And it's like this every day. We have busloads of tourists going by. Sometimes I can hear the guides on the loudspeakers saying, "This is the home of Jacqueline Kennedy, Caroline, and John. We have become a sort of, there ought to be a nicer word for it than freak show, but I don't know what it is. I really am becoming tired of starring in everyone's vacation movies. Thus, you see, my dark glasses. It might be that all of them out there are looking at me, but none of them can tell who I am looking back at. At least that way I can have some fun with it. To be quite honest with all of you, I hardly know what I'm going to do next. Should I stay here in Washington with no privacy and stared at constantly? I know that when my husband died, I always said I was going to stay in the places where Jack and I had lived, but now I'm really not so sure. I hardly know what to do next. Oh, but forgive me. All of you did not come here to hear about my troubles. My topic today is not the incessant nuisance of the prying public, but my experiences as the wife of a US senator and then president. But of course, for that, I hardly know where to begin. My experiences were not at all like those of most first ladies. Very few of them have come into the White House as the mother of two small children. Do you know I had to hire a press secretary? And I told her, my primary goal is to protect my privacy and my children's, but not to offend the press. I would like to have minimum information be given out with maximum politeness. Tell reporters I will be a wife and mother first, then first lady. Oh, you know, I still hate that term, first lady. It always sounds so much like some sort of saddle horse. You know, Caroline was affected very young. She spoke her very first words during the 1960 presidential primary. Would you like to know what they were? Goodbye, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and West Virginia. I said to Jack, well, I'm sorry that so few states have primaries. We would have had a daughter with the greatest vocabulary of any 2-year-old in the country. Now, when we got to the White House, I knew she would have to go to school. And if she were in the newspapers all the time, it would affect her little classmates. So we set up a nursery school and then a kindergarten right in the White House. The children's parents paid all the expenses for the teachers and the supplies. I just wanted to provide as much of a sense of normalcy as I could. Normalcy, as if that were even possible in the White House. Do you know the first lady I always felt the most affinity for? Mrs. Harry Truman. Well, think about it. She brought a daughter to the White House at a most difficult age, but managed to keep her from getting spoiled. She kept her family together in the White House, and that is the hardest thing to do. But that was the most wonderful part of it. In the White House, Jack was home every night, and that was wonderful for the children. Sometimes he would even have lunch with them. If you had told me that would happen in the White House, I never would have believed it. For myself, I always tried to work in the morning and then save lunch and as much of the afternoon as I could for the children. If you bungle raising your children, I don't think it matters very much what else you do. If Jack had been the greatest president of the century, but his children turned out badly, oh, that would have been tragic. But of course, when you are married to a politician, you really can't not be involved in their politics. Even when Jack and I were dating, this was back in 1952. Jack was heavily involved in his Senate campaign against Henry Cabot Lodge. So he was spending most of his weekends up in Massachusetts. He would call me up from some oyster bar with this great clinking of coins. I found myself saying, Jack, darling, is that you? I can barely hear you. The movies Wednesday? Well, yes, I will be here in Washington. Will you? How he could switch so rapidly from political campaigning to dating, I will never understand. This was always one of Jack's great charms. He had this ability to focus and then just shift focus so rapidly. My life did change when I met Jack, but not for the reasons most people think. We met in 1951 at a dinner party by friends of ours who had been shamelessly matchmaking for nearly a year. Usually that sort of thing does not work out, but this time it did, so I am grateful. Jack was different, something special. I remember that my mother used to bring around all these bows for me, but Jack really was different. I was working at that point as a reporter for the Washington Times Herald newspaper. I was their inquiring photography girl. It's not very demanding work, but it got me out. My job was to walk the streets of Washington and ask hard-hitting questions like, do you think the rich enjoy life more than the poor do? Or do you think a wife should let her husband think he is smarter than she is? I even interviewed Jack. To him I said, tell me, Congressman Kennedy, can you think of any reason why a contented young bachelor would want to get married? The job, you see, was mostly to defy my mother. She had refused me a chance to do an internship at Vogue magazine. 6 months in New York, 6 months in Paris. I won the contest for that internship, but my mother had other plans for me. My mother was always rather strict with us. She never hesitated to give us the back of her hand when she thought it necessary. Us, that's my sister, Lee, and I. Lee was always the pretty one. I guess I was supposed to be the smart one. Now, if you see pictures of my family, the gentleman that you will see in them is probably not going to be my father. You'll see my stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss, very nice man. My mother married him when I was 11, 2 years after my parents divorced. But I did see a good deal of my father, especially after I went away to boarding school at Miss Porter's. All my Farmington friends loved Daddy. He was the most devastating figure, drippingly handsome. All my friends adored him, and they used to line up to be taken out to eat whenever he came to visit. He would take batches of us to lunch at the Elm Tree Inn and sit there, drink in hand, while we all ordered steaks and 2 desserts each. We must have eaten him broke. To my mother, school was supposed to lead to marriage. Parties and dances, I attended my fair share, but Newport, where I spent most of my summers when I was growing up, when I was about 19, I did not know what I wanted in life, but I knew I did not want to marry any of the young men that I had grown up with. But not because of them, but because of this lifestyle. Handsome young scions of rich families. Ugh. They bored me in about 5 minutes. I remember once saying to this young man I had just met, well, I'm amazed. You have your whole life planned out that way? Let me see if I have this right. Career, marriage, house, dog, country club, children? Well, tell me, do you have your gravesite picked out yet? Me? Yeah. The only thing that matters to me in a man is that he weigh more and have bigger feet than I do. Size 10, good heavens. To my mother, this was the height of carelessness. Jacqueline, she would say, your choice of a husband is the most important decision you will ever make. Be smart, Jacqueline. Better to be bored with a rich man than bored with a poor one. So you see, when Jack and I were dating, I was not at all sure I even wanted to marry. A cousin of mine asked once, was there any truth to the rumors that Jack and I were serious? I said to him, well, you know, Jack goes to a hairdresser almost every day to have his hair done. And if, when we're at a party or a reception or something, no one recognizes him and no photographers take his picture, he will sulk about it afterwards for hours. Really? Oh, he's so vain, you can't believe it. And he's ambitious, all right. He told me that he plans, well, his father plans, he will be president of the United States one day. My family had mixed feelings about Jack and his family. The Kennedys are like carbonated water. All other families are just flat. They would be talking about so many things with so much enthusiasm, or playing games at dinner or in the living room, anywhere. Everyone would be talking about something. They even competed with each other in conversation to see who could say the most or talk the loudest. Just watching them wore me out. The one person in my family who adored Jack was my father. My father and Jack hit it off right away. I remember we three had dinner shortly before we were engaged. They spent the whole night talking about what else? Politics, sports, and girls. It's what all red-blooded men like to talk about, I suppose. Not long after that, I went to see my aunt. Auntie Edie, I want you to know I've become engaged to Jack Kennedy. Yes, but you cannot tell anyone about it for a little while because it wouldn't be fair to the Saturday Evening Post. The Post, they're coming out tomorrow with a story about Jack. On the cover, Jack Kennedy, the Senate's gay young bachelor. I know. I have taken the choicest bachelor in the Senate. And I was hoping for a small, elegant wedding, but the Kennedys would have none of that. We had 26 groomsmen and bridesmaids at our wedding, 900 guests at the mass, 1,200 at the reception. My mother was terrified of Jack because she couldn't push him around at all. I, of course, expected that my father would walk me down the aisle, but on the morning of the wedding, he started drinking. And my mother refused to even permit him to attend the wedding. My stepfather, Uncle Hughie, had to step in and walk me down the aisle. I would like to thank all of you so much for coming here today and sharing this day with us. Do you know, my mother always told me I should wait and judge a man by the quality of his correspondence. Wish you were here. Cheers, Jack. This is my entire correspondence from Jack Kennedy. Living with Jack was like being married to a whirlwind. He was indestructible. People who tried to keep up with him dropped like flies, including me. I remember one morning, the very first year we were married, he said to me, what are you having for the 40 people who are coming for luncheon today? No one had told me anything about it. It was 11 o'clock in the morning and they were expected at 1. I was in a panic. And Jack was traveling all over the country in those days, giving speeches. He was never home more than 2 nights in a row. I was alone almost every weekend. It was all wrong. Politics was sort of my enemy as far as our home life was concerned. And my other enemy, well, I went into our marriage with my eyes open. My sister-in-law, Joan, she was married to Jack's brother, Teddy. She had more illusions than I did. I remember saying to her, Jonesy, I don't think there are very many husbands who are faithful to their wives. Kennedy men are like that. They'll go after anything in a skirt. You have to block it out. Imagine you are turning the station on a radio when you don't like what's playing. But we worked it out. We made concessions. Jack learned to enjoy fine cuisine more than just his favorite pigs in a blanket. I boned up on American history and I learned how to play golf. Jack began to dress much more fastidiously. He even agreed to go to art galleries and ballets with me. I sometimes could help him in his work. A speech on Indochina, where much of the original source material was in French. But my most important role, the best thing I could do for him, was to be a distraction. A husband lives and breathes his work all day long. If he comes home to more table thumping, how could the poor man ever relax? So I never said anything or did anything upsetting. And when he came home, I always had his favorite record playing and perhaps a few friends. Oh, and his favorite drink, a daiquiri. I must share with you this. This is Jack Kennedy's favorite daiquiri recipe. You mix 2 parts Bacardi rum with 2 parts frozen limeade. Add 1 part fresh lime juice and a few drops of falernum. The fresh lime juice, that's key. I would have so much preferred to remain like that. Behind the scenes, not out in front, always being stared at and analyzed. Everything you do, what you wear, what you say. I'm so grateful to my parents for the efforts they made to teach us foreign languages. The people that we met campaigning who contributed so much to our country. To me, it seemed only a common courtesy to address them in their own tongues. Queridos amigos, les hablan la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. Para el futuro de nuestros niños, votan ustedes para el Partido Democrática. You know, so much of politics is unfair. It always seemed to me so unfair of people to be against Jack merely because he was a Catholic. He was such a poor Catholic. If it had been his brother Bobby, I might have understood it more. And all those letters coming to say I should change my hairstyle to something more fitting for the wife of a presidential candidate. Jack used to always say to my secretary, "Oh, Mary, how's the mail coming on Jackie's hair?" Amusing, perhaps, but also puzzling. What does my hairdo have to do with my husband's ability to be president? I did bar photographers from taking any photographs of me smoking. Jack was such a bear about my cigarettes. I finally started encouraging him to have a cigar after dinner, because at least that way he would not complain so much about my cigarettes. It was a bad habit that I picked up in boarding school. I was always trying to imitate the girls who had callers every Saturday night. I passed the finish line up in the balcony of the Normandy Theater in New York by a girl who pressed a cigarette on me and then led me out when an usher came to complain. People could not hear the film with all that coughing going on. So no photographs smoking. And then Women's Wear Daily complained that Jack's mother and I each spent $40,000 a year on French clothing. Well, that's just dreadfully unfair. I told them I couldn't spend that much unless I wore sable underwear. I am sure that I spent less on clothing than Mrs. Nixon did. But I have to dress well, Jack, so I don't embarrass you. As a public figure, you would be humiliated if your wife were photographed in some saggy old house dress. Everyone would say your wife is a slob and refuse to vote for you. Of course, for most of that campaign, I knew I was expecting another baby and could not play much part. I thought I should be with Jack, and if it hadn't been for the baby, I would have campaigned vigorously. Oh, I can't be so presumptuous as to think I would have had an impact on the outcome, but it would have been tragic if Jack had lost by a few votes merely because I was not at his side and people had met Mrs. Nixon and liked her. Of course, at least it got me out of those dreadful chicken dinners. You know, sitting at a head table where you couldn't have a cigarette, having to wear those silly corsages and listen to some old windbag. It drove me up the wall. Poor Jack. But all his hard work paid off in November. His deepest wish, well, his father's deepest wish come true. The 35th President of the United States. I heard Jack's inaugural address in little bits and pieces many times when he was working on it at the Kennedy Winter Home in Palm Beach. There were piles of yellow paper covered with his notes all over our bedroom floor. But when I heard it that day in Washington as a whole for the very first time, it was so pure and beautiful and soaring. I knew I was hearing something great. I knew it would go down in history as one of the greatest speeches ever given. Do you remember? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. There was so much I wanted to say, but I could hardly have embraced him in front of all those people. So when we had a moment alone, I just said to him, Jack, you were wonderful. And he was smiling in the most touching and the most vulnerable way. His family was walking on air, but to me, it was terrifying. It really is frightening to lose all your anonymity at age 31. We had to begin giving parties and receptions, and we traveled a great deal, Jack and I. Fortunately, Jack never required very much more from me than perhaps to give a short speech or two. I know we share the desire of bringing to all the people of this hemisphere a better life for themselves and their children. And I know you will agree with me that the good things in life, education, housing, employment, should be within the reach of all people and not just a few, blessed by fortune. I never envied Jack the difficult tasks. When we were in Vienna, such a difficult summit. Jack always compared the Soviet Premier, Nikita Khrushchev, to his father, always expecting all give and no take. There was very little I could do, but perhaps I could help the Khrushchevs feel a bit more comfortable. One afternoon at tea, the crowds outside our window started calling out, Jackie, Jackie. So I asked Mrs. Khrushchev to come to the window with me. We waved to the crowds together, and soon they were calling out, Jackie, Nina, Jackie, Nina. A small contribution to international diplomacy, but it was something I could do. When I visited India and Pakistan, it was without Jack, and I had no desire to be a public figure on my own. I know that the international press criticized me on that trip for wearing high fashion in a country so overrun with poverty. I finally had to tell my press attaché, do not release any more fashion information. I know that I am more of fashion interest than other first ladies, but really, I don't want to be plagued by any more stories of a sensational nature. I don't want to be the Marie Antoinette or Empress Josephine of the 1960s. I'm glad that I went, but I vowed never to do another trip like that again. Jack was always so proud of me when I did something like that, but really, I can't stand being out in front. I know that this probably will sound trite to you, but what I really wanted was to be behind Jack and to be a good wife and mother. What I wanted most was to make the White House the most perfect house in America. That mansion is so much more than just the official center of the executive branch and a place to entertain. It should be a showplace of a great heritage and an inspiration to all Americans. But when Mrs. Eisenhower showed me around the very first time, all I could think was, oh God, this is the worst place in the world. It was so cold and dreary. It looked like it had been furnished by a discount furniture store during a January clearance. The windows did not open, and when we tried to use the fireplaces, they smoked because they had not been used in so long. And so little about history. All these people were coming to tour the White House. They saw almost nothing that dated back to before 1948. I knew I'd feel terribly if I'd lived in that house for 4 years and had not done anything for those rooms. Jack was worried. He had to be convinced of the worthiness of the project, so we set up a fine arts committee and hired a curator. We went through all 54 rooms of the White House looking for forgotten historical treasures. I felt so strongly that the White House should have as fine a collection of American paintings as possible. What's so important, the setting in which the presidency is presented to the world, to foreign visitors. And we've had such a wonderful history. The American people should be proud of it. Do you remember Walter Annenberg, the great newspaper and magazine publisher? He had a portrait of Benjamin Franklin that I knew would be perfect for the White House. So I called him up. I told him about our plans to make the White House a national monument. I said to him, Mr. Annenberg, you are the first citizen of Philadelphia. And of course, in his day, Ben Franklin was the first citizen of Philadelphia. Do you think that one great Philadelphia resident would give the White House a portrait of another great Philadelphia resident? And do you know, even though that painting had cost him more than $250,000, he gave it. We relied on donations like that, and a booklet that we put together all about the White House. Aside from the obvious benefit of having a booklet we could sell, I knew it would be a source of revenue for us, so we would not have to beg and borrow for each item desired. So many things slipped through our hands because we could not raise the money in time. I finally said to Jack, you know, you always balk at spending a few $1,000s on a lovely picture, but I think you would spend any amount of money if it could buy you votes. Eventually, he came around. It was Jack who decided we ought to have a television program about the restoration. He convinced CBS to do the taping right in the White House. Nervous? Absolutely. I think I only got through that taping with the help of Marlboros and several strong scotches. The program aired on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1962, simultaneously on CBS and NBC, and the following Sunday on ABC. I have been told 46 million Americans watched it. That's 3 out of 4 of every American who owned a television. I was not one of them, but I am glad for the visibility that it gave to our work. I just thought everything in the White House should be the best. The entertainment that was given there, and if it was an American company who could help, I like to do that. If not, just so long as it was the best. My husband and I shared a belief that the artist should be honored by society. The arts have always been a poor stepchild in this country. Our great museums and performing companies, of course, should be supported, but the unknown in the beginning should also be thrown a bone. And you know, Jack tried so hard. When we succeeded in bringing the great cellist Pablo Casals to the White House, I had to station my social secretary, Letitia Baldridge, behind a doorway directly in Jack's line of view. That way she could signal to him when the music was really over. Otherwise, there was always the danger that Jack would leap up at any slight pause in the music and start shaking the artist's hand. I had so much hope to one day have a minister for the arts in the cabinet, as they do in France. Meeting the French Minister of Culture was one of the highlights of my years in the White House. I remember saying to him, Monsieur Malraux, it is such a pleasure to meet you. I have such an affinity for your country. Do you know, both of my grandparents were French. What's that? Yours were too? Monsieur Malraux, I've been thinking so much about something you said. You said that art, that public places with sculpture can affect someone as they're rushing off to work, perhaps change their opinion of themselves. Oh, isn't that wonderful? Family, though, that is most important. Whatever work I did, I never let it interfere with our family life. Jack and I both wanted a large family. When I found out I was expecting another baby, we were both ecstatic. When Patrick was born in August, he only lived 2 days. He was 5 weeks early and he was so little, just 5 pounds. And Jack was inconsolable. Shocking as it was for me, I think it was even worse for him. He nearly collapsed over it. And I was so melancholy after Patrick's death. I went away on vacation, and perhaps I stayed away longer than I should have. And perhaps I was a bit snappish when I got back. I could have made his life so much happier those last few weeks. I could have tried harder to get over my melancholy. I could have kept him from going to Texas. It was a political fence mending trip, starting the campaign for 1964. all that he said to me was, I'd love you to go with me, but only if you want to go. You could be a great help to me, but if you don't want to go, I will understand. So I went with him to Texas, even though I knew I would hate every minute of it. But Jack wanted me there. It seemed like a small sacrifice on my part. And I did have a feeling it was going well. Oh, there were such big crowds of such wavy, nice, happy people, wonderful assemblies and warm welcomes. 3 times we were greeted with the yellow roses of Texas. Only when we got to Dallas, they gave me red roses. I can remember thinking, how funny to be given red roses when you're in Texas. When we got to Dallas, there was the biggest motorcade from the airport. And when we were all in the cars, the motorcade was ready to begin. One of Jack's assistants came running up to me, and he said to me, "Now you make sure to look to your left, away from the president. You wave at the people on your side. If you both wave at the same voter, it's just a waste." So in that motorcade, I usually was looking to the left, and Jack was looking to the right, which is one reason we were not looking at each other very often. And I remember it was terribly hot, just blinding all of us. And at one point, Mrs. Connolly, the governor's wife, she was sitting in front of me. She turned around and she said, "Well, Mr. President, you certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you." And he said, "No, you can't," or something like that. And she said, "We'll be there soon." Now, in a motorcade, there is always noise, and there are motorcycles beside you, a lot of them backfiring. There was a noise, but it didn't seem to me like any different sort of noise, because there always is noise. There's motorcycles and things. I was looking to the left when suddenly I heard Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of Jack, suddenly call out, "Oh, no, no, no!" And so I turned to the right. And all I remember is my husband. He had this sort of puzzled look on his face and his hands were up. I remember thinking he looked just as if he had a slight headache. I just remember that. No blood or anything. And then he slumped down into my lap. And then I just remember being down in the car with his head on my lap. I know that there were photographs later of me climbing out the back of the car. I don't remember that at all. I just remember being down in the car, and there was so much confusion. And it seemed like an eternity, that ride to the hospital. And when we got to the hospital, they tried to take me away. They tried to grab me. And I kept saying to people, "I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him." I remember there was this long corridor. This big policeman brought me a chair, and so I sat there and I watched them all going in with saline solutions and other things. And for a minute, I thought to myself, maybe he's not gone. Maybe he's still alive. I saw them going in, and for a minute I thought, maybe. I knew he was gone. And then I saw a doctor coming towards me, and he said to me, "Mrs. Kennedy, you need a sedative." And I said to him, "I want to be with him when he goes." And this doctor forced his way in. He just kept saying, "It's her prerogative, it's her prerogative." So I finally got in. There must have been 40 people in that tiny little operating room. They had already put a sheet over Jack, but his foot was sticking out of the sheet. So I took his foot and I kissed it. And then someone found his hand under the sheet, and I just held on to it all the time the priest was saying the extreme unction. And all that I could think was, if only I had been looking to the right, I would have seen the first shot hit him and I could have pulled him down. I was looking to the left. Well, there is one last thing that I would like to say. Actually, I'm really rather ashamed of myself. Jack, every time he ever quoted anything, it was always Greek or Roman. And yet one thing keeps going through my head. This line from a musical comedy. I remember saying to Bobby, I have to talk with somebody. I have to see somebody. This line from a musical comedy has become an obsession with me. At night, before going to bed, we had this old Victrola and we'd put on a record. I'd get out of bed at night when it was so cold and play a record. And there was a song that he loved at the end. He loved Camelot. It's the last song on the last side of the record. Ask every person if he's heard the story, and tell it loud and clear if he has not, how once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment. And it'll never be that way again. I know there will be other great presidents, and the Johnsons have been wonderful to me, but there'll never be another Camelot. Jack loved history so much. History made Jack what he was. This sick little boy, he sat and read history. Scarlet fever, this little boy who was sick so much. All the time he was sick as a boy, he was reading history. He was reading Marlborough and the Knights of the Round Table, and he just loved that song. So then I thought, well, if history made Jack what he was, then perhaps others too. History. I will tell all of you one thing. When this is all finally over, I am going to crawl into the deepest retirement there is. I'm not going to be one of those people who goes around talking about themselves. I don't want to go out on a Kennedy drive, to go to a Kennedy airport, to visit a Kennedy school. I don't want medals for Jack. I don't want to be seen by crowds. I have everything I want. I have that flame at Arlington Cemetery. Sometimes at night, you know, you come over the hill and you see that Lee mansion all lit up. I care about that flame. And Caroline, do you know, all through the funeral services, Caroline held onto my hand like a trooper. She's my helper. She's mine now. John, well, John makes friends with everyone immediately. He surprises me in so many ways. I would like John to grow up to be a good boy. I have no better wish for him. I would like John to be a fine young man. He's so interested in airplanes, perhaps he'll be an astronaut, or just plain John Kennedy Jr. fixing airplanes on the ground. And so do you know, I think I've known the answer to my question all along. My question earlier about what to do next, there's really only one thing I can do, isn't there? Save my children. They have to grow up without thinking back at their father's murder all the time. They have to grow up attuned to life in a very important way. Moving to New York with John and Caroline, that will be good for me and stop me from brooding all the time. That is how I wish to live my life. Oh, I can't thank all of you enough for coming here today and being with me. You know, perhaps together, all of us, perhaps we can others help those, like those crowds outside my house, to understand we are all human. Even though a person may be very well known, they have the same emotions in their heart for those moments that are the most important we will ever know in life, for marriage and death and life. And so I do remain Mrs. John F. Kennedy. Thank you all so, so much. And now I'm going to plug back in. Now, Wendy, I'd like to open it up for questions if we could.
That was great.
Yes.
Let's see. Hang on.
Give the ground rules one more time. If you have questions, go ahead and write them in. If you click on the button, if you move your cursor, there should be that button that says Q&A. You can type your question in there, and then Wendy can read it.
Yes. Some of the questions have already been answered. Let's see. How specifically historically accurate is your script?
I am going to, so everyone knows, I took off my gloves and I will take off my pillbox hat so you know I'm Leslie again. You know, that's such a good question, because of all the portrayals that I do, this is one of the most difficult for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's hard to do Jackie's soft, whispery voice, and everybody knows her voice. It's hard to do that and be heard. But in terms of the script, it was a challenging one. Jackie rarely gave interviews. She did not write an autobiography. She didn't really keep a diary. What I tried to do was two things. Where possible, I tried to use her own stories and her own words, or I read a lot of interviews with people who knew her. So for example, some of it is very accurate in terms of, for example, the story about what she experienced during the assassination. That is taken primarily from the testimony that she gave to the Warren Commission investigating the assassination, and an interview that she did with Ted White of Life magazine a couple weeks after the assassination. In some other cases, we really have to rely on a mixture of events that happened, what we know of Jackie's personality. So for example, she never talked about what she felt about JFK's womanizing. I know you'll be shocked when I say we know today that Jack was quite the womanizer, but we do know from people who knew her and knew him that Jackie was aware of what was going on. She might not have been aware of the full extent of it, but she knew what was going on, and she sort of agreed to go along with it. So the part of the script that was about the advice to Ted Kennedy's wife, Joan, that is largely speculated. Having said that, all of the situations, all of the scenarios are accurate to the best of my knowledge. She did learn how to smoke in the balcony of a theater in New York. She did hide it from cameras, things like that. The bones of the story are all accurate to the best of my ability.
Great, thank you. What did you use for your historical resources?
Again, it was tough. I used the answer is I used anything I could. This was a really hard one to research because the Kennedys are so much the source of myth and legend. I read as much as I could in the secondary sources on Jackie and the Kennedys, and that's coming out all the time. There's always new books. Did you see, by any the way, anyone see there was just a new book by James Patterson came out with a book called The Kennedys about the whole Kennedy clan. I read those, and then what I tried to do is go back to the original record, meaning not just newspaper articles, although that was a big source for me, but also books by people who knew her and interviews that were done. She did do a couple of interviews. I tried to locate those, especially before JFK's election, she did those, and conversations, memoirs from people who knew her. So it was kind of a piecing together as much as I could. It was a real challenge, and you know, I tried as best as I can to stick only to the verifiable sources. legends like, did she have an affair with Bobby Kennedy that are unprovable. They seem to be more the source of legend than anything else, although who knows. Those I tried to stay away from.
Okay. Interesting that you would mention that, because Michelle would like to know, what was Jackie's relationship with Bobby?
It's funny. There is no question that they were very close. And Bobby was the closest to JFK in the White House. I mean, Bobby, you might remember, Bobby was named Attorney General when JFK was president, which was a controversial move because he was young and had a lot of experience as a lawyer. But what it means is when JFK was assassinated, the two people who were the most directly impacted were Bobby and Jackie. And that made them very close. And there's no question that Bobby really moved in as a kind of surrogate father figure to both Caroline and John Jr. Jackie and Bobby were very, very close. They even had houses close to each other. There are rumors that they had an affair. That's usually based on, the next door neighbor's housekeeper's cousin heard about, seeing them kissing. There's no direct evidence of it. Now, who knows? The Kennedys certainly the male Kennedys were known for having plenty of affairs. I find it doubtful in that we know that Jackie was very in love with her husband at the end. JFK and Jackie had a very tumultuous marriage, and in the early days, there were some signs they were heading towards divorce. They became much closer in the years in the White House. And Jackie said those were the happiest years. She saw him all the time, which had not been true before. And the death of Patrick in August of '63 brought them closer than they had ever been. People who knew them said they were extremely close. So I'm not sure that Jackie, certainly in the years right after JFK's death, I'm not sure she would have been open to any kind of an intense affair. But again, who knows? Maybe I'm giving her more credit.
Okay. Sally would like to know, how did she get along with her mother-in-law, Rose?
Complicated. It's so funny. I always feel like Jackie and Rose should have gotten along so well because they had so much in common. They both loved fashion. By the way, Jackie spent, she joked about, I could never spend $40,000. I think in 1962, she spent something like $62,000 on clothes. That's the equivalent today of probably somewhere in the range of $160,000, $170,000. She spent a lot on clothes. They both had to put up with husbands who were philanderers. They were both very devoted to their image in society, things like that. But there seems to have been a certain sense that they never really became very, very close. Jackie was a little wary of all the women in the Kennedy clan. She called them the toothy girls. And part of it was because they were a very raucous family. They were known, of course, if you know the Kennedys, they're known for football games and all of that. And Jackie was much more of an introvert, a private person than that. The girls in the Kennedy family called her the Deb. The person that she was closest to, other than JFK and Bobby, was probably Joe Sr. She adored Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy was a lot like her father, certainly in his sense of his own power and presence, in his womanizing. People say that after Joe Kennedy had a stroke, Jackie was the warmest towards him. She never, sometimes when someone has a stroke, people can act sort of, they don't know how to act around them. Jackie was perfectly comfortable. By all accounts, she had a great love for Joe Kennedy.
Wow. Great. Okay, let's see. Rosalind comments, I saw an exhibit of her clothes. Did you know Coco Chanel? And there's a lot of interest in Jackie's clothing.
Yes. Did anyone see the exhibit at the Field Museum? What was that, maybe 15 years ago? Yes, and in fact, wait, I've got it here. There is a terrific book that I highly recommend. I don't know if I can get this, my camera to focus. It's called No, it's not going to focus for me. Jacqueline Kennedy, The White House Years. This was the companion to that exhibit. So if you're interested in her clothes, this is like a treasure. Oh, look at the picture I opened right to. That's a great book to find. You know, it is true. Jackie was in a really tight situation because as First Lady, she had to work primarily with an American designer. So her key designer was Oleg Cassini. A lot of her most famous outfits, especially the red outfit that she wore for the tour of the White House, that was Oleg Cassini. However, she was known to buy French designer originals. When she had dinner at Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors, she was wearing, who was it? I think it was Givenchy, an original Givenchy, as a nod to France and a French designer. She was known to actually have her sister, Lee was living in London at this point. She would sometimes have Lee buy designer originals and send them directly to Jackie so that people wouldn't know. But what she often did, and that was the case with the pink suit that you might recognize. This is a replica of the suit she wore on November 22nd, 1963. This suit is a good example of what she did. Coco Chanel, I don't know, or I don't remember if she ever met Coco Chanel. She adored Chanel, no question. She had a lot of Chanel clothing or Chanel knockoff clothing. Chanel actually permitted line for line copies of her clothing to be made by other dressmakers. In other words, you would buy the rights to make a Chanel original using Chanel approved fabrics and direct patterns from Chanel. The suit that Jackie wore on November 22nd was one of those. It was made by a place called Chez Mignon in New York City. It was an approved replica of a Chanel. That was perfect for Jackie. She loved it.
Were there any photographs of Jackie wearing maternity clothes as First Lady?
There are only a few. She was very much in the habit of hiding it. There's two famously that I remember. You know, she was pregnant with John Jr. much of the time when JFK was campaigning for president, but she did participate in a few events, including there's one event where you can see her on stage. She's wearing it's actually a very nice looking dress. It doesn't look like a maternity dress, but it's very tent shaped. She's wearing that. There was a parade that she participated in very close to the election. And remember, you know, the election happens in early November. John Jr. was born the last week of November. So she was very pregnant at the end of the election. But she was in a parade. She's sitting with JFK on the back of a convertible car. They're both waving to the crowd. And you can see she's wearing a coat, but it's a very thick coat, and it really covers her up. There's another famous photograph of her in 1963 in the summer. She's on the back of the Kennedy yacht, not a yacht, well, it was a boat, it was a big boat. She's got her hair up, she's wearing a loose tent-style dress. She doesn't look that pregnant. And she's smoking a cigarette. It's not that hard a photograph to find. It's kind of funny to see. But those are rare. She did not like herself photographed, smoking or pregnant. So that was rare.
Jackie is interested in finding out how you find your costumes and accessories for all the portrayals.
Oh, you know, it is all over wherever I can. This particular suit I actually had made by a dressmaker. I found her, it was just someone on Etsy. I was looking to see if anyone was doing replicas, and sometimes I can find that. You know, when I do Grace Kelly, I found someone who does replicas of a Grace Kelly dress. And in this case, I did. I also, though, I do a lot of shopping at vintage stores. It takes a while to get through them. Thank goodness for Etsy. It's made it a lot easier. Sometimes I have to have costumes made. If it's anything before about 1930, 1940, I have to have clothing made. In the case of Jackie, I actually was able to find, these are actually Chanel earrings that I found, costume jewelry. And I do have, although when I wear gloves, you can't really see it, but you know how sometimes they do replicas of famous
jewelry. I do have some of Jackie's replicas. This is just a regular pearls, but they have made replicas of her pearls. I have a replica. I don't know if I can get it to show. It's going to show up kind of funny because it's green. It's a replica of her engagement ring. John F. Kennedy gave her a fabulous, I believe it was a 3-carat emerald ring, this giant cocktail ring. She later had it reset. It is not at all Jackie Kennedy's style. Jackie Kennedy and her jewelry, she liked to have very clean, classic style. But it's not that hard to find replicas of her jewelry, and it's always, you know, gorgeous.
Where's that ring now?
I believe it's at I know, it's at the JFK Library and Museum. In fact, a lot of Jackie's clothing is there, and a lot of her jewelry is there, and a lot of her papers, although you might already be thinking of this, many of her papers are not yet open to the public. Some of her official documents relating to her work as First Lady has been made available to the public. Her private letters, her private papers are still under lock and key and not accessible to researchers. They've all got various deadlines of, 60 years after Jackie's death or 150 years. I was telling Wendy earlier, the pink suit, which does still exist, is at the National Archives. It is under an agreement that it will not be exhibited prior to 2103, by which time probably most of us will be gone unless science really changes between then and now.
Interesting. Mildred would like to know, how long did it take you to create this performance?
How long did it take? It took a long time. This one in particular, it usually takes me about a year. I think this one took about a year and a half, mostly because there's been so much written about the Kennedys. Typically what I do is I set aside about 5 to 7 months to do the research, to really dig into the secondary sources and the primary sources, and to write the script. That is the most time-consuming part of it. Then it's another usually 3, 4, 5 months to rehearse it, to get the costume, to memorize the script. I work from a script. Some people who do historical portrayals don't. I come from a theater background, so that's what I'm most comfortable with. So that's what I do. But it's time consuming. And with Jackie, I actually spent a lot of time watching any videos, and there aren't a lot, but you can watch videos of her, her giving speeches and television commercials for campaigns. I watched the tour of the White House, trying to get a little bit of her voice and things like that. By the way, that television commercial where she's talked in Spanish, votan ustedes para Partido Democrática, that actually is a commercial that she made. It's available on YouTube, and you can look it up. The speech I gave where she was talking about all want better for our children, that also I took the words straight from a speech that was recorded. So it makes Jackie a lot more challenging than someone like, say, Clara Barton, who there's no recordings of her audio or video.
Right. And her voice was very distinctive, very breathy, and
yes,
that's probably difficult to speak in a similar way.
Yeah, it's very hard. And do you know, when she was giving the tour of the White House on television, at one point, Charles Collingworth, the interviewer, he said, "We're having trouble hearing you. Could you talk in your normal voice?" Jackie said, "This is my normal voice." The question of Jackie's voice is actually a really fascinating one, because some people who knew her as a child or as a teenager said she never spoke in that breathy way. It might have been the case that she kind of, I don't want to say it was a pretense, but it might have been that she cultivated a little bit of that breathiness, because that was a voice for women that was very feminine for the time. There certainly was a case where she expressed to some people a little bit of concern that she was too smart, that a woman shouldn't be quite as, I know you'll be shocked to hear me say this, but it's possible that she thought that voice made her a little more appealing, But it's also true that if you hear recordings of her on the telephone, she's still using that voice. She didn't drop the voice. Do you remember a couple of years ago when that company, the blood company Theranos, was in the news, and the director of that company, the founder of it, Elizabeth Holmes, she had this very deep voice, and people were saying, is that her real voice? Again, there were some people who say, I knew her before and she never spoke that way. Or her family said it actually was her real voice. But there was speculation that Elizabeth Holmes was deepening her voice to make her appear more professional and authoritative. It's possible Jackie was doing a similar thing to make herself look, you know, more feminine. If so, how sad, you know? I mean, really.
Very interesting. Did Jackie have an idol in her younger years or even in her adult life, either before or after her marriage?
Oh gosh, you know, probably more than anyone, her father. She writes about her father in the most glowing terms. And one of the really unfair things was that he died so young. He died in 1957, the same year that Caroline Kennedy was born. She writes about him in ways that are really, you know, almost like, does he deserve such glowing praise? Jack Bouvier was very, very handsome, very debonair. She adored how debonair he was and how much her friends loved him. And he seems to have been very much aware of the importance of public image. And Jackie, throughout her life, she was a master at shaping public perception. A lot of what we think of the Kennedy administration was shaped by Jackie. Certainly, there's a lot of indication she adored her father more than her mother. She had a strained relationship often with her mother. But there are others that she admired. You know, she was a great lover of poetry. And one thing Caroline Kennedy has done is to publish some of Jackie Kennedy's best beloved poets. She was authors were always her great passion. I know, but I'm trying to remember the people that she wrote about for the essay that she did to win the contest that would have given her, you know, 6 months in New York and 6 months in Paris. And I want to say she wanted to meet like Baudelaire and Oscar Wilde. She saw herself as a sort of stage director of the world, and she wanted to bring in their ideas and sort of set the world up according to them, if my memory is serving me. I think she was very drawn to people who see the beauty in the world, and people who have an awareness of just the importance of appreciating the highest and best in the world. And that's what she brought to the White House.
Absolutely. Can you talk about her relationship with her sister Lee?
Oh, yes. You know, it's funny. They were extremely close for years. Lee passed away this year. Lee was 4 years younger than Jackie, and they were extremely close growing up, partly because this was a Catholic family and their parents divorced. And that was tough for them, moving in really high New York circles. They were different from a lot of their friends. So they were very close because of that. Throughout the years in the White House, Lee and Jackie were always, always close. But there's a real sense that Lee had been idolized for being so beautiful. And she was. And it was, by all accounts, hard for Lee when suddenly the world's attention was on Jackie and she was in the sidelines. Lee went with Jackie on Jackie's famous trip to India and Pakistan. And very often in photographs, everybody would be clamoring around Jackie. And it was like, oh yeah, and here's Lee off to the side. And that was hard. Lee was forever trying to improve her life. She married multiple times. She struggled with alcoholism. She wanted to be an actress for a while, and she was terrible, and Jackie did not approve of that. They were never as close again, from what I understand, after Jackie was out of the White House as they had been prior to that. But they were never estranged in a way that some siblings are. At the time that Jackie died, in her will, she did not leave anything to Lee. And a lot of people were scandalized by that. Although what she said was, I have done a lot for my sister during my life, and she knows that. And so some people have taken that as a sign of enduring acrimony between them. It might have been a little bit of that, but more likely it was the fact that Jackie did help Lee financially a lot during their lives.
And I believe their children were close.
Yes, their children were very, very close. And you'll see them in photographs, photographs of Kennedy Christmases, photographs of Kennedys in the summertime, photographs of Jackie on vacation with her kids. Very often Lee and her children are there as well. Yeah.
Okay. Harriet comments, the PBS series on the Kennedys portrayed Jackie as strongly suffering from and objecting to her husband's affairs. At one point, she wanted to divorce him, but changed her mind. Was that an over-dramatization?
That from what I have researched, if Jackie did feel that way, she kept it to herself. There's not a lot of record of that level of anger that she felt about it. Now, she might have, but it doesn't show up in the historical record. What does show up in the historical record is that she knew what was going on. And one of JFK's very best friends said explicitly, he was interviewed, and he said, I took her out to lunch before the wedding, and I said, look, this is who Jack is, and he's not going to change. And there are stories about things like one time she was taking a French reporter on a tour of the White House, and she opened up a door and she said, oh, she said in French, and here are the secretaries who are supposedly sleeping with my husband. And people also said, she was known to take very long weekends to their summer home in Virginia. Like she would leave on Thursday morning and come back Monday night. When she was coming back, she always made absolutely sure people knew when she was coming back, when she would be arriving, so that if there was anything going on, it would be gone by the time she arrived. Again, I don't know if she knew the full extent. Given how much she idolized her father, I think it's very likely that she felt there was an agreement that as long as he was discreet and as long as he did not humiliate her publicly, she would permit a certain amount of leeway in that respect. And in exchange, she expected to be permitted to do what she wanted to do, which was to go away for things like long weekends from Thursday through Monday. In the White House, she would sometimes spend more than 3 months of the summer out of Washington, either at Hyannisport or at her mother's place in Newport. She would spend a month at Christmas down in Palm Beach at their home. She was away from the White House a lot. The interesting question, I think, what would have happened if JFK had been reelected? Because he was for sure getting more reckless and less careful in his womanizing.
Wow. Based on what you know about her, are you surprised with her choice of a second husband?
Am I surprised at her choice of a second husband? I'm really not. If you don't know, Jackie married Aristotle Onassis in 1968. I would say no for two main reasons. Number one, the thing Jackie wanted more than anything was privacy and security for her children. When Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, she said, if they're killing Kennedys, my kids are target number one. I want out of this country. She did have Secret Service protection, but Onassis offered her a lot more. And number two, he was fabulously wealthy. And Jackie, she does seem to have had a certain shopping, she enjoyed shopping therapy, shall we say. And certainly JFK left her very well off, but not as well off to live in the style to which she had become accustomed. He could, and Aristotle Onassis, say what you will about his looks, he could be extremely charming when he wanted to be. So no, you know, when she married Onassis, someone said, but you won't be on a pedestal anymore. And she said, I don't want to be on a pedestal. I want to be a human being. And I think that was true. Now, the Onassis marriage was not a success. And a lot of people say they probably would have divorced had it not been for Onassis's death in 75.
Are many of the changes she made in the White House today still in place?
Are many of the changes that she made still in place? You know, yes and no. No, in the sense that, you know, the White House gets very, very heavily used. And within just a few years, a lot of what she had installed, you know, the curtains were getting worn out. A lot of the carpets were getting worn out. So no, it has changed. The specific furnishings, and you know, the most delicate furnishings have changed. There's no question that a lot more art has been acquired since her time. A lot more furnishings have been acquired since her time. But, and by the way, here's fun trivia for you. Did you know that it was actually Pat Nixon who brought in she brought in more authentic antiques than Jackie ever did. I think when Jackie left, about 1/3 of the furnishings in the White House were authentic American originals, art and furniture. By the time that Pat Nixon left, it was well over 2/3, if not more so. Pat Nixon did even more than Jackie. But really, the reason we think of Jackie as being so important is because she was. Up to that point, any president who moved in could dispense of any furniture. There were presidents who would sell off furnishings of their predecessors for you know, their own gain. So what Jackie did was to make the White House a museum, to say anything you donate will become part of the permanent White House Historical Association collection. It cannot be sold. That is what encouraged a lot of people to actually donate some of the best examples of American art and furnishings. And absolutely, a lot of the paintings that she commissioned, that she solicited, are still part of the collection. A lot of the furniture that she acquired is still there. And moreover, just the general, the general sense of it all, you know, the fact that the Lincoln room is going to be, the Lincoln bedroom is a bedroom furnished to that era. That was all established by Jackie. So she really does deserve a lot of credit for that restoration project.
Interesting. Can you tell us about the backdrop that we're looking at
now?
now?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you reminded me. This backdrop, I don't actually have images of the interior of the house she lived in Georgetown for a year. So what I'm showing you here is actually the Queen's sitting room in the White House. The Queen's bedroom is one of the guest suites on the family quarters on the second floor. And from what we know, this is how it looked in Jackie's time. And I know from seeing images of Jackie's own apartment in New York City, this style was very popular with Jackie. The idea that you could have the wallpaper and the curtains in the same fabric, and in this case, they even covered chairs with it. Jackie liked to decorate, and you see it here, in a style that mixed together real authentic pieces like authentic end tables, an authentic parlor table, with comfortable furnishings. I mean, these chairs, they don't look like something where you'd be terrified to sit in them because they're some kind of precious antique. When Betty Ford came into the White House, she said, you know, Pat came in and replaced all of Jackie's comfortable chairs with these, you know, authentic antiques that, you know, they hurt you forever when you sit down in them. So this room, I thought, was a really good representation of the style that Jackie often wore. And doesn't it sort of look like kind of timeless? I mean, I would not look at something like this and say, oh my God, it looks so early 60s. That's very typical of how Jackie liked to decorate.
Okay, great. Let's see, we have some really interesting questions. What were Jackie's feelings about her son being called John John?
She did not like it. There's no indication the family ever called him that. It's apparently when John Kennedy was first moving into the White House, at one point John Jr. ran away, and reporter heard JFK say, John, John, and thought it was the family nickname, but it wasn't. Jackie wasn't obnoxious about it, but she did at least one time say that she really did not like the nickname John John.
Okay. When you talked about Jackie and her thoughts about John with airplanes, did that, something like that really happen?
Yeah, it really did happen. And John Jr., I mean, he was a newborn when he was very young. He was 2 months old when his parents moved into the White House. He was fascinated by the helicopters and the airplanes that he saw his father in all the time. And there are a lot of people who say he would come running when he heard a helicopter going. So he was fascinated by it. It is, however, true that he did not pursue his private pilot's license until after Jackie died. Jackie did not want him to become a pilot. So she passed away in '94. He then got his pilot's license. And you might remember he died in that airplane crash when he was piloting in 1999. I always find it one of the great ironies that he was so in love with airplanes. It is true, though, that she did say at one point, maybe he will someday be an astronaut. Who knows? And the irony is huge.
Such a sad day. What was the relationship with the Johnsons during the presidency?
Jackie was nicer to the Johnsons than most of the other people in the Kennedy administration. There's not a lot of sign that JFK embraced Lyndon Johnson in much of a way. Certainly we know Bobby Kennedy just hated Johnson. Jackie was much warmer towards them for a couple of reasons. Number one, that Lady Bird was always stepping in for Jackie, so Jackie could do things that she wanted to do. Jackie's staff actually nicknamed Lady Bird Saint Bird because she stepped in so often. And Jackie was very kind to the Johnsons afterwards. There are recordings of her talking on the phone to Lyndon Johnson where he really wants her to come back to the White House because it would be good for him politically to have the most famous, beloved widow with him. She never did. She said it was just too painful. Now, having said that, though, there's plenty of indication that she was a little, she was known to make fun of them. I think she called him like Uncle Cornpone, and she did have a little bit of a look down her nose condescension towards these Texans. So warm, but not friendly closeness, shall I say.
Phyllis has a question. What was the secret with her shoes? I read one shoe and each pair had a 1/4 inch lift fixed to her heel.
Yeah, apparently there's a couple things about her shoes. Number one, she did have big feet. She did wear a size 10. She also had a big head. That's why she wore her pillbox hats back on her head. It made it easier to fit. It is true. She did have a lift. Apparently, one of her designers noticed that she had a bit of a funny walk. She had a little bit. I mean, it's not really that odd, a little bit of a bow-legged walk. But apparently, one of her, who was it? I can't remember if it was her designer or maybe one of her secretaries said, if you put a little bit of a lift in one of your shoes, it'll smooth that out. And she always did. JFK had a lift in one of his shoes too. A doctor had noticed. Oh, it's a doctor. I think it was his doctor had noticed that one of his legs was slightly shorter than the other. Now, this is very common in human beings, so it's not that unusual. But it is true. She also, however, always wore low-heeled shoes. Someone asked her, what's your best advice for a political wife? And she said, low-heeled shoes. Just because it is hard, actually, to stand for long periods of time in heels. And these were the days, if you're a politician's wife in the late 50s, early 60s, you did not go around wearing pants and loafers. In her spare time, however, Jackie was much more casual than you see. She was known to go barefoot or wear casual sandals that cost, a couple $100. But she was never quite as fancy in her free time as she was in public.
Did Jackie bite her nails?
She did, yes. I love the fact, don't you love it when people that we idolize have have little flaws? She did. She bit her nails quite badly, and she for sure smoked. So those were, and spent a lot. Those are her vices, really. So something reassuring in knowing, it's not total perfection.
Yes, she was human.
Yeah.
How long have you been portraying Jackie?
How long have I been portraying Jackie? Quite a while. This program was actually commissioned, and I believe it was back in 2008, 2009. So I've been doing this more than 12 years. And interestingly, when I did it, I was still in my closer to 30, and every year I get older, and she's sort of perpetually 34, which is what she was at the time of the assassination. I keep thinking that maybe I should do an update or talk about her life in the years after JFK. I find her experiences in the White House so fascinating because it's not always what I expected. It is what I expected, and it isn't. And I find that fascinating. So maybe I will. Maybe it's time.
And in New York, she was a publisher or an editor.
An editor. Mm-hmm.
She had a great career there.
She did. And in fact, there's a great book. I think it's called Reading Jackie. And it's about how the books that she edited reveal a lot about her. She did a lot of books on in the Russian style, about Russian aesthetics, really. She did Kelsey Kirkland, the ballerina, her memoirs.
Michael Jackson wasn't there?
Michael Jackson, yes, she did, because Michael Jackson said he wanted her as an editor, and she very kindly agreed to step in. Being an editor was really kind of the perfect work for her because it let her be involved in the world of arts and writing without being in the spotlight. She always said the author is the person in the spotlight. It was perfect. And people who worked with her said she would answer her own phone. She got her own coffee. She would stand in line for the copy machine like anyone else. She seems to have adored it. She worked for Viking Press first and then for Doubleday for about 19 years. Is that right? Right up until just before her death in 94. And I should mention, those last years of her life, a lot of people say were her happiest. She spent a longer time with her companion, Maurice Templesman, than she did with either JFK or with Onassis. They began their relationship in the early 80s and were together until her death. Templesman is not well known. They never married, but they were devoted to each other. They lived together. He was a good match for her. He's a very erudite man. He loves the arts, very wealthy, loved his privacy. In many ways, the perfect companion for her. And she did live long enough to see Caroline's 3 children be born. She, of course, didn't live to see them grow up, but which is a huge tragedy. But at least...
And she loved being a grandmother.
She did. She did. They called her Grand Jackie, like grand-mère. Turned into Grand Jackie, and she adored them. And there's some great photographs of her in Central Park buying an ice cream cone with her grandkids, and it just, your heart breaks when you see them.
What was her relationship like with Caroline as an adult?
Very, very close. She was always so close to both of her children. She always said that this was the greatest achievement of her life, was to have raised 2 children who were as down to earth and well-adjusted as Caroline and John were. They were extremely close. And there's some great photographs of the 2 of them. And because they shared so much in common, they would love to go to the ballet together. They were known regularly they had made appearances at the John F. Kennedy Library. And, Caroline has taken on a lot of the Profiles in Courage awards. So, in many ways, I think Jackie's greatest pride, if she were alive today, would be seeing how well Caroline has been a mother to her children in the same kind of close, balancing privacy with the need for maintaining a legacy. Caroline has done that in much the same way that Jackie tried so hard to do and did.
Why did Jackie choose to be buried next to Jack instead of her second husband?
You know, well, a lot of the reason I think is because by the end of her marriage with Onassis, relationships between them were extremely strained and probably headed for divorce. You know, for a couple of reasons. One of the things that Jackie really worked hardest on in her years after the assassination was preserving John F. Kennedy's legacy. And undoubtedly part of that legacy was his legacy as a father. Now, Jackie never talked about it, so part of what I will say is speculation. But I speculate as well that she felt that that is where her contribution to the historical legacy of the United States was the strongest. That seems to imply that she had this craving for fame, and I don't think that that's true at all. But what she did crave very much is that history be remembered and that the Kennedy years be remembered as a time of positiveness, given how, you know, she saw firsthand the hatred towards a lot of what he did, which is true of almost any politician. I know it's hard to think. There are, you know, people who don't like the, you know, a sitting president might be the target of dislike, but she felt that very strongly. So I suspect that was a part of it. She also wasn't, I don't think she'd want to be married next to Onassis, and she wasn't going to be buried next to Templesman. So this was in some ways the logical place for her to be.
Okay. One final question. How do you pick the characters that you select to portray?
It's such a hard thing. It always has to be some area of overlap between something I find compelling and fascinating and someone who I find compelling and fascinating. In the case of Jackie, I was worried. I was worried about it because she's so idolized, and I thought, you know, I don't really look that much like her, and certainly the voice is hard and all of that. I found her compelling once I dug into the story and realized just how big her contribution was to the memory of the Kennedy years and how important she was in what we think of when we think of the Kennedy years. But also it's the case that she is a character who, because she lived in a time which is within living memory, and she had she was one of those rare people whose charisma was unbelievably powerful. So it was a nice blending of what I found interesting and what I thought the public would find interesting. That's what I look for.
Wonderful. Leslie, thank you so much. Thank you again to the Levy Senior Center Foundation. Thank you to Abidor Evanston. Leslie, this has just been fabulous. Next week, we will see you for the final portrayal that you're doing for us this summer. That would be Eleanor Roosevelt, and right after Memorial Day, so that's completely appropriate, and we're all looking forward to that. Thank you so much. Have a great week, everyone. Stay safe.
My pleasure.
Okay.
See you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.